Masechet Yevamot of Samech Het. We begin on Samech Zayin Amud Bet with the Mishnah. It picks up on the case of Ha'ubar. If a woman has a fetus, that fetus will disqualify her from eating terumah. That's what we were talking about before. And now we're going to talk about other similar cases that also disqualify the mother. The common denominator of all these cases are that they are poslin velo ma'achilin, which means that no matter which way it is, if she was a bat Yisrael and she was married to a Kohen, so now while she's married, she can eat terumah. However, if he dies and they have no living children, and she is pregnant, even though she is pregnant with the child of a Kohen who will be born, when he's born, he'll be a Kohen. But right now, while she is in the status, she cannot eat terumah. She has no family connection to her deceased husband, so she cannot eat terumah. The other way around also, the fetus will not allow her to, that's v'lo machilin. It's also poslin. If she is a bat kohen, so she grew up, she was able to eat terumah. She got married to a Yisrael, so while she's married, she's under Yisrael, and she cannot eat terumah. If her husband dies, then she should be able to go back to her father's house and eat terumah. But if he dies and leaves her without children, but with a fetus, that fetus will disqualify her from going back to her father's house. So there you go. The ubad is a double whammy. It disqualifies her both ways, whether she is the bat kohen or whether she is married to the kohen. And that is true also for the next case. V'hayavam, if someone was married to a bat Yisrael, was married to a kohen, and he dies without children, and now the yavam, she's waiting for the yavam to do yibum, and the yavam is a kohen, but because they didn't do yibum yet, it's not sufficient. That zika is not sufficient to allow her to eat terumah. And the same thing the other way around. If she was a bat kohen and now she at home, she when growing up she could eat terumah, but now she's awaiting a Yisrael, even though she's not married to the Yisrael yavam. That zika is enough to disqualify her, so she doesn't eat terumah either way. Also, v'ha'erusin, if someone is engaged, she's a bat kohen and she becomes betrothed to a Yisrael, that is sufficient to disqualify her, poslin. And the other way around is also namachilin, if she's a bat Yisrael and she does betrothed to a kohen, even though she's betrothed to a kohen, but no, she cannot eat. Well, the Gemara will say why. Cheresh is someone who does not have sufficient da'at, is not sufficiently mindful in those days, because they didn't know, couldn't be educated to enact a full marriage, and so therefore that's the same. And ben tisha shanim v'yom echad, a boy who is under adulthood but more than 9 years old and a day. We'll see, the Gemara will discuss what case this exactly is referring to. All these, poslin velo machilin, she is disqualified if she was a bat kohen from eating terumah, and if she is a bat Yisrael, that these people, although they are kohanim, cannot entitle her to eat terumah. Other more cases. Safek shu ben tesha shanim v'yom echad, safek she'eno, safek hevi sheteh sarot v'safek she'lo hevi. If we're not sure whether he is 9 years old or not, whether he's a katan or 9 years old, a 9-year-old can perform an act that is considered a sexual act, even though he's a minor, so won't be responsible. But it is defined as an act of bi'ah. Shteh se'arot is when the kid is 13 years old. We also need 2 hairs to actually become an adult. And this case is referring to a Yisrael who does kiddushin with a bat kohen, and it says that this is sufficient to remove her from her bat kohen status, and she has to stop eating terumah. This is true when he's an adult, and so in that case he can fully do kiddushin. And it's also true even if there is a safek, maybe he's a minor, and the minor cannot perform kiddushin. And nevertheless, since it's in doubt, so she has to stop eating terumah. That's the chiddush of that case. And finally, Nafal Habitah alav al bat achi ve'en yadua eze met rishon. Sarata choleset ve'lo mityabem. It's a different case where a man is married to 2 women. One of them not related. One of them is his niece. And now a house falls on this man, and it kills not only him, but also the wife who is his niece. The wife who is not related is not in the house, and she is fine. She is alive. Now, all this, he dies without children, leaving his brother. His brother, whose daughter now also died in this ruin. The question is, can the surviving brother, the Yavam, perform Yibum on the surviving co-wife who is not related? Well, it depends on who dies first. If the brother died first, then that would mean at that moment there are two women alive that are Yevamot, and one of them is the Yavam's daughter, and so that's Sarat Adva. So he does not do Yibum with her, cannot do Yibum with the other wife either. No need to do Chalitza, and they both go free. Turns out his daughter died a few minutes later in the ruin, but nevertheless, since at that moment, within those few minutes, he was patur from Yibum or Chalitza, therefore he cannot do Yibum, no need to do Chalitza. However, if his daughter died first, then right then during those few minutes, the brother who's about to die is married only to one woman who's not related, and then he dies without children. So in that case, the surviving brother, the Yavam, would need to do Yibum or Chalitza with the surviving wife who was not related. And at that time that the deceased brother died, he was already not connected with the niece because she died first. And so in that case would have to do Yibum or Chalitza. Since we don't know who died first, so he has to do Chalitza just in case it's needed, and he cannot do Yibum in case it's not needed. All right, that's the last case. Now the Gemara will go through each of the list of the cases in the Mishnah and explain it. Ha'ubar, if there is a fetus. I bat kohen l'Yisrael, hi pasil la. So this means that if you have a bat kohen and she's married to a Yisrael, and then so during that time while she's married she cannot eat tirumah. And now this Yisrael dies. Well, if there was no children at all, she could go back to her father's house and eat tirumah. But if he died and left her pregnant, so now because she is pregnant with a child who from a Yisrael, so that fetus is sufficient to disqualify her. Why? Kin oreha. What's the source? So Pasuk says, if she has no children, v'shaba el bet avia, she can go back to her father's house. Kin oreha, as when she was a kid. And just like when she was a child, she was able to eat tirumah under her father's house. She can go back afterwards. But that only applies if she is in the same state like when she was a child. When she was a kid, she was not pregnant with a fetus. So only if she goes back not pregnant, then she can eat tirumah again. But here, because she is pregnant, perat moberet, so kin oreha comes to exclude a case where she is pregnant. She cannot go back to her father's house and eat tirumah. And the other way around, ibat Yisrael lekohen hi lo ma'achil la. That's the case we were talking about yesterday. If bat kohen is married to a Yisrael and then he dies, leaving her pregnant, even though she has a Kohen fetus inside her, not sufficient. Yalud machil ve'sheno yalud eno machil. This was the second of the reasons that we saw yesterday. Only a child that's born can entitle someone else to eat, and not a child who is not born. Second case, hayabam. I bat kohen l'Yisrael, he pasil la. If the Yavam is a Yisrael, and she is a bat kohen, so since her husband died, she wants to go back to her father's house to eat. But the problem is she has a zika to the brother who's also Yisrael, so he disqualifies her. Veshaba el bet abiha perat l'shomeret Yavam. How do we know that? Because that same pasuk says she goes back to her father's house, but she can't go back to her father's house because she's awaiting yibum. She has a zika, she has a connection. She's not single, not totally single that she can go back. Ibat Yisrael kohen he lo ma'achila. And if the other way around, if she is a daughter of Yisrael, and so while she was married to the kohen, she was able to eat teruma, but now that her husband died, she can no longer. The yibum zika is not sufficient. If he actually does yibum, then they're fully married and he's a kohen. Yeah, fine. But before that, no good, because kinyan kaspo marachamana v'ha kinyan de'achiv. Only a kohen who acquires someone can entitle that person to eat teruma, whether it be a slave, an animal, or doing kiddushin, marrying a wife. That would be kinyan kaspo. But here, a zika is not yet kinyan kaspo. It's a responsibility to do yibum, but they're not yet married, so it's not sufficient to entitle her. V'ha'erusin, bat kohen d'Israel hi pasil la. If she was a bat kohen and she was able to eat teruma growing up, and now this Yisrael comes and gives her a ring, does kiddushin, well, now she is connected to this Yisrael and no longer under her father's house, even though he's not feeding her yet and all that, but sufficiently connected that she is disqualified. Deha kanya b'havaya, because he acquired her through this kiddushin, so it is an acquisition. So now she's connected to Israel, she loses her right. And if she is a bat Israel and now a kohen acquires her, so really midoraita, she should be able to eat teruma, because now she is acquired with the kiddushin to this kohen. But Ula warned against it midirabanan, because she's still living in her father's house and eating from her father's food. And so now, if we would allow her, and Doraita it is allowed, and she's sitting in there in her father's house eating teruma, so then someone else in the house will walk by, her sibling, her parents will say, oh, I'll have some of that too, and they will end up eating the teruma. So therefore, it's not a good idea midirabanan. V'hacheresh, someone who is deaf-mute and who does not have full intellectual capacity to perform a marriage. I bat kohen Israel hi pasil la dahakanyal betakanta derabanan. So even though they can't perform a full marriage, the rabbis came and made a takana that the marriage is effective on a derabanan level. So therefore, if she's a bat kohen and she marries someone who is deaf, so that marriage is effective midrabanan, and that by itself is sufficient to remove her bat kohen status, and she has to stop eating teruma, disqualifies. Vi bat Yisrael kohen, and she's bat Yisrael, and she marries a kohen who is deaf. Lo ma'achil, since it's not a full marriage, it's not sufficient to allow her to eat teruma under him, because we need kinyan kaspo. We need a full marriage, amarachamana v'hayla bar kinyan hu, and that this person does not have the intellectual capability of making a full acquisition through marriage. Okay, and now we get to the complicated one, uben tesha shanim, someone who's a 9-year-old. So what case is it talking about? Kasal gadatan b'shomeret yavam leben tesha v'yom echad. Must be that this case is it talking about, maybe it can't be just talking about marriage, because a 9-year-old and someone under 13 cannot perform a marriage, so that wouldn't be an interesting case. So maybe it's talking about a shomeret yavam, because we saw that in order to do yibum, you don't need full da'at, and even a child, as long as he can do bi'ah, that's where it has to be 9 in a day, can perform yibum. So let's see if this works, depending on the scenario. So Lemai, which scenario would it apply to? Mifsal, if she was a bat kohen growing up, and now she married a Yisrael, so she had to stop. The Yisrael dies without children, leaving her to this 9-year-old who awaiting yibum. Well, if that's the case, and it's telling us that she is now disqualified, because she remains disqualified because she has a zika to a Yisrael, well then it would not be significant that the kid is 9 years old. Kataname mifsal pasel, even if he was 8 years old or 3 years old, it wouldn't matter, since she has a zika to a Yisrael. She cannot go back to her father's house and eat teruma. She is disqualified no matter what the age. Ila achole, and if it's the other way around, that she is a bat Yisrael and she was married to a kohen, so she was able to eat teruma while married, and now this guy dies without children, and she has a zika to the brother, who's also Kohen, well then it also makes no difference what age he is. Gadol nameh lo machil, even if he was 30 years old, because it's only a zika and not a marriage, she cannot eat terumah. So the age would not make any difference if that was the case. Therefore, that cannot be the situation. Amar Abaye, hacha b'yabam ben tesha shanim v'yom echad haba al yevimto askinan. We're not talking about a shomeret yavam, that she's waiting for him to do yibum, but rather where the yavam actually did yibum. He did bi'ah. Now, if it's an adult, then the bi'ah fully works and they're fully married. And if it's a child, child cannot do bi'ah and has no effect. If it's 9 years old or between 9 and 13, oh, that's what we're talking about. On a deoraita level, the yibum works. And so we might think that, oh, well, since it works, so she can now eat terumah. He fully acquires her. He's 9, so the bi'ah is a valid act, and so now they're married, so she can eat. Kamash malan asu bi'at ben tesha shanim v'yom echad kema'amar begadol. And so now the Mishnah comes to teach us that the rabbis came and said, no, we're not going to consider this full marriage since he is not yet an adult. And so they treated it as if it was an adult that only did ma'amar, which only makes a dirabanan connection. And so that could be the scenario that is talking about. All right, that's according to Abaye. Amar leRava ihachi sefa dekatani safek ben tesha shanim v'yom echad safek she'eno hashta vadai ben tesha lo ma'achil safek mi ba'ya. Rava challenges Abaye from the next clause in the Mishnah that talks about someone we are in doubt exactly how old he is. That also disqualifies. Well, that doesn't make sense. If someone who is for sure over 9 years old, between 9 and 13, will not entitle his wife to eat terumah after performing yibum, because the rabbis reduce it from a deoraita to a drabanan. They disqualify this yibum with the 9-year-old, and that's for sure he's 9 years old. Then you don't have to tell me that if we're not even sure he's 9 years old, then for sure this minor Kohen will not entitle his wife to eat terumah. So that would be obvious. That can't be the case that the Mishnah is talking about. Ela marava beben tesha shanim v'yom echad dehanach pesulim katane tepasle bebiatan. Rather, it's not talking about a yibum case at all. Rava says it's talking about the following disqualified people that we're going to see in this baraita. If any of them are at least 9 years old, then their bi'ah is considered a valid act, and because they are disqualified, they will also disqualify their wife from ever being permitted to marry a Kohen. All these people will make their wives, if they marry, they're not allowed to marry. If they do, they make their wives into halalot. Well, we'll see why. It could be because of zonah, or the Gemara will introduce a different reason. So who are these people that are disqualified and disqualify their wives? Ukhdetanya ben tesha shanim v'yom echad ger amoni umoavi mitzri va'adomi kuti natin chalal umamzer shabal bau al kohenet liviya v'Yisrael pesaluha. So anyone who is at least 9 years old and a day, if they're under that, then any act that they do is not considered bi'ah. But if they're over that, then if it was an Ammonite convert or a Moabite, both of these are not allowed. Men are not allowed to marry into the Jewish nation, and also an Egyptian and an Edomite for a couple of generations cannot marry in. Kuti Samaritan are not machloket about whether they're considered valid converts or not. According to this one here, not Natin, Gibeonite, who converted under false pretenses. Someone who themselves, a man who is halal, who marries, who is with any woman, will make her into a halala, or if he's a mamzer, any of these people that have bi'ah with any woman, whether she's a Kohen Levi or Yisraelit, they make her they disqualify her from eating terumah forever and from ever marrying a kohen. Okay, now, so that's what it's talking about according to Rava. And that would mean that also the next clause in the Mishnah, which says, and even if we're in doubt whether these guys are 9 years old or more or less than 9 years old, even then they also disqualify. So in this way, it is actually a chidush to tell us that even though they might be younger, but we're not sure, they also disqualify. So Rava resolves that question. Now, hold on. In the next Mishnah we're going to see tomorrow, it has a line that says, anyone who's not allowed to marry into the Jewish nation will also disqualify those women from marrying a Kohen ever, making them halalim. So if that's what it's talking about in the next Mishnah, then it sounds like this Mishnah is not talking about those cases, something different. And we answered, Kahal, Sefa Pisule Kehuna. No, this Mishnah, our Mishnah here, as Rava explained, it is talking about those who cannot marry anyone in the Jewish nation, all this list. Whereas the next Mishnah is talking specifically about those people who cannot marry a Kohen. So that's another different category, more limited category, and so there's no contradiction. Okay, gufa. Now we're gonna, since we cited this interesting baraita, let's analyze it further. Ben teshash neviyom echad ged amoni umavi misri adomi kuti natin halal mamzer shval kohenet livia Yisrael pisalan. That's exactly what we just saw. But the continuation of the baraita adds two other opinions here, and says Rabbi Yosef Omer kol shezar al pasul posel, kol she'en zaro pasul eno posel. Anyone whose children are disqualified, they will also disqualify the person that they are married to. And anyone whose children are not disqualified will not. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel has a similar formulation, but a little bit different. Anyone that you can marry their daughter, you could also marry that person's wife if she became a widow, even a Kohen can marry her. And anyone where a Kohen would not be able to marry the daughter, so he also would not be able to marry the widow. Okay, these what they are talking about is going to be explained on the further on the next daf, and what exactly the machloket is. So we'll leave that for now. Now we ask, back to the basic list that was just in that baraita of all those people. How do we know that they would cause a woman who they're married to become a halala? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Amar Kira Ubat Kohen ki tiye leish zar kevan shenib'ala lapasula pesala. Because the pasuk says any bat Kohen is what we're talking about. If she is with a zar, a foreign man, he betrumat kodashim lo to. We're taking the word zad in this pasuk not to refer just to a Yisrael, but rather someone who is excluded, someone who's disqualified, they cannot marry anybody in the Jewish nation, and so if they do, she cannot eat terumah ever again. She becomes a permanent halala. That's where we're learning it from. Now we ask about that. Wait a second, how do you know it means that? Maybe it means just the simple law that a bat kohen who is married to a non-priest, that's totally permitted. Not a disqualified person. While she's married to a Yisrael, even though she was a bat kohen, she cannot eat terumah during the marriage. Right? Maybe it's just teaching us the simple, straightforward law. It says no, we know that already from a different pasuk. Hahi ummi v'shava el bet avia kin oreha melechem aviha tochel. This is a bat kohen. If she is an amana gerusha, then she and zera en la. She has no children, so shama, she goes back to her father's house. So we can figure that means she can only eat terumah afterwards when she goes back to her father's house. While she's married, she cannot. Nafka midekamara chamana v'shabal bet avia tochel mikela demikara lo achla. So we can derive from this that since the pasuk says she goes back to her father's house and then she can once again eat terumah, that means that while she was married to Israel, she wasn't allowed. So I already know the basic law from here, leaving this pasuk 12. to be the extra one to teach me about the disqualified people in the Baraita. So we say no. I cannot know it from this pasuk. Because this pasuk formulates it as a misfat assay. She can go back to her father's house to eat afterwards. And I only inferred a lo ta'aseh from an assay, so that only has the power of a misfat assay. Katav rachamana lelav. So maybe I still need pasuk 12 to teach me that's not only a misfat assay, but that there's also a lo ta'aseh for a bat kohen who's married to Israel to eat terumah. So the Gemara counters this. Is lav mikol zar lo yochal kodesh nafka. The prohibition of a bat kohen married to Israel from eating terumah has an assay and a lav, and the lav comes from pasuk 10, the first pasuk in this series. It's worth taking a moment to look at the pisukim that we're dealing with here. All have happened to come from Parashat HaShavua. That actually they go in order. It says v'chol zar lo yochal kodesh toshab kohen v'sacheh lo yochal kodesh. So any non-kohen cannot eat sacred food, sacred korbanot, sacred terumah. Kohen ki yikneh nefesh ken kaspo. However, if you acquire someone as a slave, then they can, or yilid beto, his family, his children, also can eat his food, including terumah. And now it gets to bat kohen kidesh izad. So while she was a child, she was yilid beto, she was able to eat terumah. But when she marries a non-kohen, then she cannot eat bitrumata kodashim. Notice that it says terumah and kodashim here, which in Peshat maybe just means one thing, but the Gemara will say it refers to both terumah and kodashim and korbanot. She cannot eat when she goes and gets married. However, if she comes back, almana grusha, and she has no children, then she goes back to her father's house as she was before, and she can once again eat milechem abiha tochel. We're going to see this talking about terumah only and not kodashim. And then the repeats vechol za lo yachabo, and any foreigner cannot eat. This is seems to be an unnecessary repetition. Maybe in Peshat just here to as a closing statement to finish off the list. But although it does go on here. So anyway, the Gemara is going to learn from each and every detail of these pisukim so that we can have a derivation for all of the halachot. Okay, so far so good. We have this pasuk 12 that's teaching us about the disqualified people. If they take a kohen, then that woman is disqualified forever, and that's just fine, because regarding a normal case of a bat kohen married to Israel, we have an assay and the lo ta'aseh from pasuk 10. But then we reject this. Wait, we need pasuk 10 just for the basic case of a Yisrael cannot eat terumah. You need to know that. And so kol zar Yisrael cannot eat terumah. We answer today v'chol zar kitib. Actually, there's two times it says v'chol zar, as we just saw. It says it at the end v'chol zar lo yachal bo, and in the beginning kol zar lo yachal bo. It opens and closes in the same way, and so from that we learn both of these halachot. Okay. No, but still we need a pasuk for this law of Rabbi Yosef. Amar Rabbi Yosef bar Rabbi Chanina v'chol zar zarut amarti lecha velo aninut. How do we know that a kohen can eat terumah even when he's onen, when he's in mourning, on the day when from the time that a relative dies until the burial? During aninut period, for example, people cannot eat maaser sheni. It's too happy of a thing. So maybe you think that a kohen cannot eat terumah at the time of aninut. Vechol zar teaches us that only someone who is a zar, who is a non-kohen, cannot eat terumah, but it does not exclude aninut. So therefore, someone who is onen is allowed to eat terumah. So I need one of the vechol zars for this law. We answer no. Mi zar vechol zar nafka. I can learn Rabbi Yosef's teaching from the extra word vechol that it says. So from the doubling of the zar, I learn the regular law of Israel, and from vechol zar, I learn the teaching of Rabbi Yosef. So we're good. Okay, but we still need this pasuk 12 that we were using this whole time for the disqualified people in the Braita. That's what we're aiming at the entire time. That very pasuk we need for another teaching that says, Kishi chozeret litruma, vena chozeret lechaze vashok. When a girl, bat kohen, is growing up, she is allowed to eat not only teruma, but also she can eat the parts of a shelamim that go to the kohen, which is the chazeh and shok. She can eat it when she's growing up. But once she gets married to Israel and she stops eating everything, even when she gets divorced or widowed, then she goes back to her father's house. She can eat teruma, but never again can eat the parts of the korban. And how do we know that? Ubat kohen ki tiye leish zar hi bitrumat hakodashim lo tochel. That's the pasuk 12 that we were using, and so we need that to teach me that she cannot, even when once she is with another man, with Israel, she can no longer eat kodashim forever, even if she goes back. Lo tochal bamuram min hakodashim. She cannot eat that which is consecrated as an offering. So you see, I need that pasuk. No, we answer, Im ken nichtov kerahi bakodashim lo tochel. My bitrumat kodashim shmat mina tarte. No, if I was going to learn that, I could have learned it just from, right, batkon kite elishad he. If it just said hakodashim lo tochel, then I would have known that. But since it says bitrumat hakodashim lo tochel, so that extra word says we can in fact learn two things from it. Number one, that when she goes back, she does not eat kodashim, and number two, if she marries a disqualified person, like one of these Ammoni, Moabi, then she becomes a halala, and she cannot eat teruma ever again, and cannot marry a kohen ever again. All right, so that concludes that derivation of that law. Now that a kohen, bat kohen, who marries any of these becomes disqualified. Ashkahan kohenet, Leviya v'Yisraelit minelan. What's our source that a bat Levi or a bat Yisrael who has bi'ah with any of those prohibited people like Ammoni, Moavi, how do you know that if they do that, then they also will never again be allowed to eat teruma, and also will not be allowed to marry a kohen? Amarav bat ubat hachaname bat ubat. As we saw in a different case, we learned from the extra letter ubat. So to here we will learn from that extra letter. If we look in the Pisukem, you can see that two Pisukem, both 12 and 13, start off with this ubat kohen, ubat kohen. It would seem to me that we're referring to the one in Pasuk 12 here, because that's where we learned the law regarding a bat kohen, kite lizar. So now bat kohen, the comes to include also a bat Israel, will have the same law. All right, good. Kiman, well, this derivation only works according to the Midrashic system of Rabbi Akiva. He derives things even from one extra letter. He'll derive laws. He's the one that derives mountains and mountains of laws from even crowns that are on the letters. Although he never actually derives anything from the crowns on the letters, he does derive from the Vav. But that would only be according to him, not according to others who don't use that methodology. And we say, Afilu temadabanan kuleh ubat kera yeterahu. This derivation would even work for Rabbanan, because it's not just the extra letter. In fact, the entire word is extra. As if we look at the Pisukem, we already know from the context that it's talking about bat kohen. Right here it says li yelid beto. So you could have just said ki tiyeh leish zar, and I would have known it's talking about a bat kohen. So in fact, the entire word is extra. So even Rabbanan, who don't generally learn things from extra letters, will agree with this derasha from the extra word. Okay, ashkechan litruma lechehuna minelan. So now I only know based on that a bat Yisrael cannot eat, who has bi'ah with one of these disqualified people, can never again eat teruma, even if she should again be with a kohen or something. But how do I know that she cannot marry a Kohen? She cannot marry. How do I know she's pasul lekehuna? We challenge this very question. Why you need a source? Atu leviyav Yisrael la lekehuna marbin lehu di letruma benot mechal terumanin hu. So wait, do we? Is not this very pasuk that we just quoted, the ubat, coming to tell me that she cannot marry, Bat Yisrael cannot marry a Kohen? I must be talking about that, because if it's talking about that she cannot eat terumah, Bat Yisrael cannot have terumah anyway. So unless she's married to a Kohen, so it's enough just to say she can't marry a Kohen. Why do she would not be able to eat terumah as a single person anyway? So why are you looking for another source? We say no, there is such a case. Ala malo mashkechat la dekachla bishvil bena. For example, if a Bat Yisrael was married to a Kohen and they had a child and the Kohen died, then she can continue eating terumah because she has a child, so she's connected with the Kohen, with this Kohen family. And so we need you need a pasuk to tell me that from now on, if after this point, if she has a child, she's eating terumah, then she has bi'ah with one of those disqualified people, then she has to stop. So we need a pasuk for that. So we still need a pasuk to teach me that she cannot marry a Kohen in the future. Okay, bishvil bena. Wait a second. If it's just that case of because of her son, kal vachomer ma kohenet biktusha nafsha achla pasil la leviyav Yisrael de la achla ela bishvil bena lo kol sheken. I don't need a pasuk to tell me about this case because I could learn about that case from a kal vachomer. If you have a bat kohen who can eat terumah because of her own holiness. She has own holiness. She has on a high level of holiness because she's a bat kohen, and so just because of that, she normally can eat terumah when she's single. And yet, even though she has this high level of holiness, if she has bi'ah with one of those disqualified people, then she becomes disqualified. So, Bat Levi or Bat Yisrael, who don't have that level of holiness, and the only reason she can eat terumah is because she has a son from a Kohen who she was once married to, all the more so that she will be disqualified since she's on a lower level of holiness herself and she only indirectly can eat terumah. So for sure that will disqualify from her from eating terumah. So you know what? I don't need another pasuk to tell me that she cannot marry a Kohen. But then we say, no, this kavachomer, I can reverse it. Hanotenet, your kavachomer is I can prove the opposite assumption. Kohenet de kadesh kufa pasila, a kohenet where she herself has a high level of holiness because of her lineage. So then if she goes and has bi'ah with one of those disqualified people, that's a bigger problem because that will disqualify her because of her holiness. De la Kadish Kufa, but this Bat Yisrael who happens to have a child from a Kohen where she herself does not have the Kedusha, La Pasila, maybe she will not have that such a problem, and her being with one of these disqualified people will not disqualify her. So we do need a source. Okay, Ela Likihuna. Okay, fine, you're right. You do need a source. We have a source that a Bat Yisrael who is with a disqualified person cannot eat terumah. How do you know that she also cannot marry a Kohen? Kavachomer megerusha, ma gerusha, shemoteret bitruma, asura lekihuna. I can learn it from a divorcee, a bat kohen who was married and divorced. She can go back to her father's house and eat terumah. She didn't do anything wrong. She just can no longer marry a kohen. But she can continue eating terumah. So zo she'asura bitruma eno din shepesula lekehuna. So there, then, if so, a bat Yisrael who herself cannot eat terumah if she's with one of those disqualified people, and we just learned from that pasuk that she cannot eat terumah. All the more so that she cannot not marry a kohen, right? If a divorcee who can eat terumah cannot marry a kohen, then the Bat Yisrael who was disqualified, who cannot eat terumah for sure, cannot marry a kohen. Okay. Last question. Hold on. Are you allowed to derive this kind of serious prohibition from a kal vachomer? We have a general law that you cannot. In this case, a warning of the prohibition. You can't derive it from a kal vachomer. We don't punish people just based on a kal vachomer. And I say you're right. Gilu milita be'al mahu. This is just revealing a source to tell us what is the exact definition and scope of the prohibition. That's all the pasuk is telling us, but it's not telling us that it's punishable from here. Just we know that things like this in general are punishable, and this is defining precisely who it is. We have now successfully derived all the laws in that baraita, and so we're good for now. Next up, we're going to reopen this question and wonder, wait a second, those are all chayave lavin. Maybe these very pisukim that you brought are to teach us that only if it's someone who's chayav karet, a relationship that's chayav karet, will be pasul, but not for a lav. But we'll leave that more extended discussion till the next daf. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen ve'amen.